The ocean has a cruel sense of humor. It swallows steel, secrets, and pride, and then dares you to find them again. The Navy brought their best, divers in gear that costs more than most houses, tech that could map the moon, hours, days, weeks of searching and nothing, just empty water. Meanwhile, a lone fisherman cast his net like it was any other day. No command, no strategy brief, no billion-dollar budget. And when he hauled it back up, there it was, the wreck everyone else had missed. The sailors stared in disbelief, the officers went pale, and the fisherman, he just lit a cigarette and said, "Maybe next time, boys." That fisherman was Jason Statham. And what he pulled from the deep wasn't just a wreck. It was the Navy's pride, torn up and dripping seawater. If you've got a few minutes, I'll tell you how one man with a net did what a fleet couldn't, and why the hardest thing they had to recover wasn't the wreck. It was their dignity. The fog was so thick you could have carved it with a knife. From the deck of the USS Resolute, the horizon had disappeared into gray, the world shrinking to a circle of churning sea and military steel. Inside that circle, divers slipped into the water one after another, bubbles trailing as they sank. Their oxygen tanks gleamed, their masks fogged, their hearts beat faster with every sweep of their flashlights. But every time they resurfaced, it was the same routine. A shake of the head, an empty report, and the admiral's temper growing hotter than the engines running below deck. "Grid sectors 1 through 5 are clear, Admiral," the XO reported, voice tight. "Clear," Admiral Kane growled. His jaw clenched, his cap tilted low to hide the fury in his eyes. "Clear means nothing. Clear means I have Washington breathing down my neck while you tell me we've got no results. Clear means useless." The XO swallowed hard, glancing back at the divers dragging themselves onto the inflatable boats. These weren't rookies, they were elite, trained for salvage, recovery, even combat if it came to it. And yet the ocean mocked them, swallowing their efforts whole. One sailor muttered under his breath, too quiet for the admiral to hear. "All this money, all this gear, might as well toss a coin and hope it hits something on the way down." Another chuckled bitter. "Hell, maybe we should hire a fisherman." They laughed, but the joke didn't last long. Because a mile out from the destroyer, barely visible in the haze, a battered wooden boat creaked along the swells. Jason Statham's boat wasn't much to look at. Paint peeling, a motor that coughed more than it purred, nets patched so many times they looked like quilts. But Jason himself, that was different. He sat on the stern like he'd been carved from the same wood his boat was made of, sleeves rolled to the elbow, rope-burned scars catching the morning light. He wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't sweating deadlines or barking orders. He was listening. Every tug of the current, every change in the wind, every shift in the color of the water, things satellites couldn't see and sonar couldn't interpret. He flicked ash from his cigarette, leaned into the net and let it sink. Back on the destroyer, one of the younger sailors caught sight of him through binoculars. "Hey, sir," he muttered to his superior. "There's a guy out there, looks like he's fishing." The officer snorted. "Fishing, in a restricted operation zone, idiot'll pull up seaweed." But the younger sailor kept watching. He saw the way Jason set his net, not random, not careless, but like he knew something the Navy didn't. And then it happened. Jason braced, rope tight in his fists, muscles coiling as the net grew heavy. Too heavy for cod, too heavy for anything that should have been there. He hauled hand over hand, arms bulging, every pull bringing up something the Navy divers had spent weeks failing to touch. The surface broke with a violent splash. Water poured across the deck of his boat. Steel rose from the deep, rusted, twisted, but unmistakable, serial code still faintly etched into its frame. A piece of the wreck. For a moment the ocean itself seemed to pause. The gulls went silent, the waves stilled. Then chaos. Radios crackled on the destroyer, voices shouting over each other. Divers froze mid-sentence. Officers shoved each other aside to get binoculars. Admiral Kane stormed forward, his face pale as he finally caught sight of it. That's impossible," he muttered. He did. But he had. Jason tied the net off like it was nothing more than another day's catch. He sat back on the rail, lit another cigarette and exhaled slow. His eyes didn't flicker to the Navy ships watching him. He didn't need to. He knew they saw. And then, almost lazily, he spoke. "Maybe next time, boys." The words drifted across the water, caught by the fog, and carried into every set of ears on that destroyer. The divers looked at each other, shame written across their faces. The sailors exchanged glances, smirking nervously because they knew what this meant. And the admiral, he realized in that moment that the Navy hadn't just failed to find a wreck. They'd been humiliated. By one fisherman with a net. By Jason Statham. And the worst part, he hadn't even looked impressed. To him, it wasn't luck. It wasn't even a challenge. It was instinct. Because Jason didn't fight the sea, he understood it. And the Navy, with all its millions, had never learned how. The Navy doesn't like being embarrassed. Not in front of their men, not in front of their admirals, and definitely not in front of a fisherman in a boat that looked like it was held together by duct tape and salt. But that was exactly what had just happened. On the deck of the USS Resolute, Admiral Kane's face was frozen in a shade somewhere between crimson and chalk. His divers had spent weeks coming up with nothing. His sonar techs had burned through 500,000 in scans. And in less than an hour, a lone fisherman had pulled the sea's secret to the surface with nothing but rope and instinct. The wreck hung there in Jason Statham's net, dripping seawater like the ocean itself was laughing at the Navy. And the worst part, Jason didn't gloat, didn't flex, didn't shout. He just smoked, calm as ever, as if he'd seen this play out long before anyone else had even gotten wet. "Launch a skiff," Kane snapped, his voice cracked like a whip. "Now." Within seconds, a pair of officers scrambled down to the deck, pulling the tarp off a rigid inflatable boat. The engine roared to life, the craft slicing through the fog as it headed toward Jason's position. Jason didn't move. He stayed perched on the edge of his boat, cigarette glowing, net tied off. He watched them come, eyes unreadable. The skiff bumped against his hull. Two officers climbed up, faces flushed with a mix of embarrassment and authority. "You're in restricted waters," one barked. "This is an active military operation." Jason didn't even blink. Funny, didn't see a sign. The officer stiffened. "That wreckage you've hauled up belongs to the United States Navy. Hand it over." Jason took another drag of his cigarette, exhaled slow, and tapped the ash against the side of his boat. "That's so." "Yes," the second officer snapped. "It's classified material you're interfering with." Jason cut him off, voice low, gravelly. "If it was classified, you wouldn't have lost it." For a moment, silence. The ocean lapped against the hulls. The officers exchanged glances, realizing every second they stood here was another second their authority slipped away. Jason leaned forward, his stare hard. "Tell your admiral something for me. Pride doesn't float, neither does incompetence." And with that, he kicked the net loose. The wreckage splashed back into the sea, vanishing beneath the waves like it had never surfaced at all. The officers were too stunned to move. Jason lit another cigarette off the dying ember of the last, calm as if he hadn't just undone days of military effort in one gesture. "Now," he said quietly, "you boys want fish, I'll sell you fish. You want wrecks, start listening to the sea instead of barking at it." They didn't reply, they couldn't. They climbed back into the skiff, humiliated, and powered away. On the Resolute, Admiral Kane's rage hit its peak. He paced the deck like a caged animal, barking at anyone who came within 10 feet. "Arrest him," Kane roared. "On what grounds, sir?" his XO asked carefully. Kane's jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer. Jason hadn't broken any laws, at least none that would stand in court. He'd simply reminded the Navy of its greatest weakness: arrogance. And every sailor, diver, and officer aboard had witnessed it. Meanwhile, Jason sat in his boat, letting the waves carry him. He knew what he'd done. He knew the Navy would stew, curse, maybe even plot. But it didn't matter. He hadn't brought that wreck up to hand it over. He'd done it to prove a point. And points, unlike wrecks, couldn't be hidden again. By the next morning, the story had already spread across the fleet. Sailors whispered it in mess halls. Divers grumbled it over their gear. Officers muttered it in closed rooms where Kane couldn't hear. "A fisherman found what we couldn't." Some called it luck, others called it skill, but either way the truth stung, and it spread fast. Jason, however, wasn't done, because he knew something the Navy didn't. The wreck wasn't just metal, it wasn't just history. It was hiding something bigger. That night Jason's boat drifted quietly over the same patch of water. The fog had lifted, replaced by a sharp moon that carved silver paths across the waves. The Navy destroyer sat miles off, still scanning, still failing. Jason lowered his net again, slowly, carefully, not where they'd told him, not where their charts suggested, but where the sea itself had whispered. The rope strained. Jason's arms flexed as he hauled inch by inch. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The net broke the surface, this time heavier, darker. Inside wasn't just steel. It was a container, marked sealed, military grade. Jason stared at it, cigarette dangling forgotten from his lips. He knew this wasn't just wreckage. This was cargo, cargo someone had hoped would stay lost forever. By sunrise, word had already leaked that the Fisherman had pulled something else up. This time, the Navy didn't send a skiff. They sent a gunboat, armed, ready. Jason didn't flinch. He just looked down at the container on his deck, then back at the men scrambling toward him with rifles slung. He muttered under his breath, "Seems the sea's not the only one with secrets."